Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I'm the chief economist at American Compass, and I am very excited for today's discussion because we will be discussing my own work, and in particular, a lecture I delivered for First Things back in March called Constructing Conservatism in a Secular Age. That has just gone up as an essay at First Things. It's part of a symposium with some terrific responses, so I hope you'll go over there and read it in full. But in conjunction with the lecture, First Things hosted a seminar for further discussion, and there I had the chance to talk with a number of wonderful scholars, but was particularly struck by the reactions from Professor Matt Mehan, who is the Associate Dean at the Graduate School of Government for Hillsdale College in Washington, D.C. And so I said, we have to keep talking about this. Will you come on the podcast? And he very graciously did. He is an incredible scholar of government, of the classics, and frankly added a lot more to my own understanding of the work that I was doing. So it's a wonderful conversation, and hope you will enjoy it and take a look at the full essay as well. I want to tell you about some of the other things we have at American Compass this week. As usual, Skylar Adletta, an electrician himself out in Ohio, has written a great piece for us on building the workforce necessary for reindustrialization. American Compass's own policy advisor, Mark DePlacido, will be up later in the week on Kamala Harris's global green ambitions and why taking the Green New Deal global may not be the best thing for our country. And the Compass Point this week is really interesting. It's from John Hendrickson of Iowans for Tax Reform. It's called Economic Nationalism in the Heartland, talking about how tariffs, even though they're often cast as bad for the agricultural sector, are actually quite popular in a place like Iowa, and looking at why that's the case and why a political coalition that's focused more on domestic production is one that would likely include much of the agricultural sector, if not necessarily some of the largest multinational corporations. So please take a look at that as well. And then finally, of course, if for some crazy reason you have not already, now is your chance to go subscribe to my Substack, Understanding America. On Monday, I was writing about the tension between opportunity and stability, and the way that the focus on the American dream as a chance to climb to the top doesn't necessarily resonate with people who, in many cases, certainly in our research, seem a lot more concerned with the promise of stability and security and what that might mean for both our politics and our public policy. So lots to read, but now I turn you over to my own conversation, and in particular, the wisdom of Dr. Mehan. I am curious if there's anything you've noticed about those students. What is your typical young conservative, maybe involved in government? How do they differ from other students, or what have you been surprised by that they really need to know?
Well, yeah. Well, what they really need to know. I'll take the first question first, which is what are they like? Which is they're practical people, which is great. It really changes the dynamic of our classes. Our classes are sort of a hybrid of lecture and Socratic seminar, and we're reading primary sources almost all the time. And in U.S. history, in politics, in the immediate concerns, but also in the great books of political philosophy and literature. But they have practical concerns. So when they encounter one of these books, they're not going to sort of get lost in a theoretical eddy or backwater. They actually have very pressing questions about the day, and that focuses our conversations in extremely productive ways. So I learned from these conversations too, but they are eager to farm out the truths of the tradition in such a way that they can apply them to their work. It's about, probably 40 some odd percent are directly working on the Hill. We have chiefs of staff, we have chief legal counsel, LDs, LCs, committee people, all kinds of lawyers and things like that. But it's a nice mix of people involved in, public policy and the public forum in one way or the other, and policy making. What they need most, frankly, one of the things I think they need is an account of human nature, that they can confidently assert which is kind of gets to, I think, the topic that your lecture at Hillsdale or at Heritage brought up, which is sort of how do you have a kind of public discourse? Well, part of the answer, a public discourse that doesn't require everyone to share the same priors on faith, is one that is adept at discussing with confidence what is the content and character of human nature that we all share, and thus that's the floor or ground for all human flourishing, which follows. And I think they know they need that. They know they want that. And then the other thing they need is a deep understanding of the American Republic and what it's sort of erected to do in this regard. Those seem to be the two things that they very openly come to us saying, I want to know these things very, very badly. And we supply it.
Well, that is a terrific segue into our topic today. What I spoke about in the lecture broadly was just the idea that, particularly on the right, conservatives have made the case and continue to make the case that our conception of virtue, our conception of the common good, built atop what we assert should be some shared morality, is rooted in faith, and typically Christian faith. And we quote John Adams on this. Russell Kirk obviously spoke about it a lot. Senator Josh Hawley just had a very good essay in First Things on the subject. The problem, in my mind, is that we are no longer a religious nation. That while certainly many people still affiliate themselves with a church or a synagogue, the share that say they draw on religion as their primary source of morality is not high and is declining. And in practice, we see that not being the language that people are comfortable with, and especially when we talk about the elite, those who are on the commanding heights of to some extent, our politics, but even more so our culture and media and our economy. The idea that one's reasoning, one's morality should be based in faith or in appeals to faith it's not just out of favor. It to some extent I've found is disqualifying. It renders an argument less persuasive, and it seems to me that that's not something that conservatives have coped with very well, and that if anything, it has led toward, on the right today, a politics that's really lacking in coherent morality. I contrast with the famous lawn signs that the liberals all have, with their "we believe in science" and "love is love" and so forth. And whatever one thinks of the substance of that creed, it is at least it is a creed, and it is rooted in what seems almost more like a religious morality than what you'll find from a Nikki Haley or a Ron DeSantis or a Donald Trump. And so, I talk also about reasons for being optimistic. We can talk about what we could do about all this, but wanted to start there. What do you make of that assessment as both for conservatism and for the American condition today?
I think a phrase you used in your talk was that a lack of these considerations leads to a kind of churlish politics, I believe, and I think that's right. I would kind of make some qualifications in agreement, but maybe even sort of pile on in another way, which is I actually think the decline of religious fervor, belief, sort of cultural confidence in faith, all those kinds of things, is actually part and parcel of that is a turning away from natural reasoned discourse, right? Is that actually that is part of, to my mind, the Christian tradition is and this I do not think is part of the public rhetoric per se for a statesman, but it is part of the backdoor thinking as you prepare a public rhetoric, I think. So if you'll indulge me for a second, I think this goes all the way back to early Christians who saw the defeat of the pagan sort of totalitarian political structure that had both religion and politics all in one power, right? In basically the political power of the gods of the city and its rulers, that once those things were separated, Christians saw that actually there was this room, this sort of field for a discourse of nature and the nature of things that before had only been in the salons or we might say the private Zoom chats of the philosophers, right? But now it actually could be part of a public discourse because you didn't have to bow to Flora, you didn't have to bow to Jupiter, you didn't have to light a candle to Hercules and all these false gods. And the Christian God, right, the Judeo-Christian Old Covenant to New Covenant tradition was now universalized, but extended or put out and beyond the control and power of the state, right? So this is sort of, so as a result, it was actually a Christian tradition to start thinking about and talking about nature uh, in a more public way than just in the philosophical schools, and sort of thinking through how might we organize ourselves given the fact, and this is the Roman Empire, that plenty of people here don't actually believe what we Christians believe. So I actually think there's a certain amount of more of this kind of natural reason talk would actually come back if there was more faith. If you, I know it seems almost counterintuitive, but I do think that's the case. It's a deep part of our tradition.
No, it makes sense, and certainly it's something that I've observed that those people who do have deep faith and sort of build more of their politics from a religious grounding are also those who are more comfortable speaking in natural law terms and reasoning in that way as well. They actually go hand in hand. They're not in conflict. It seems to me the challenge is more with the modern, particularly professional class who don't think they need any of that, and who think that essentially from some sort of pure reasoning or typically a quite economistic starting point, they can just work out what's best for everyone, and that seems to be just everybody doing whatever they want. And so the ideas of and this goes back to the root of conservatism, the idea of duty and obligation alongside privilege and right, for instance, is something they'd much rather just be free of. But then the question is there any way to communicate to them or appeal to them if an argument grounded in reason, or excuse me, an argument grounded in faith is not going to be the right one?
Yeah, so this is in one sense a replay of our discussion that we had under Rusty's hospitable eye, in that conversation, that session workshop, as you put it. Uh, Part of what we've jettisoned is, I think, the first and most fundamental public discourse work, our text, which is particularly the Roman philosophy of Cicero. Everybody quotes that Jefferson line about the texts of public right, and they say it's Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. Well, Sidney's kind of fallen by the wayside for sure. Locke is somewhat alive in certain sectors. Aristotle is somewhat alive in certain sectors. But Cicero, who was the most popular, the most translated, the most taught, the most memorized, so much so that you, as a founding father, it would have been gauche of you to quote him and then cite him. You were not allowed to cite him. The equivalent is if you said, "May the force be with you." Oh, by the way, that's from New Hope, episode 4, minute 21. Right? Like what? Like I know. It was so ubiquitous, and it was a part of our public discourse, and very much framed and helped us develop a kind of, I would not say just a natural law discourse, because we could talk about this as well. I don't think a natural law discourse per se, using traditional philosophical jargon, is actually in accord with natural law. I think natural law actually dictates that you come up with a public rhetoric that is properly fitting to the moment and to the regime, right? Its history and its present and its hoped for future. And so the idea of just blurting out teachings from the natural law, that's not in accord with natural law either. But the person we've relied on for this kind of implementation level of thinking about natural law reasoning has been the Romans, the rhetorical philosophy of the Romans, which translates the Greek rigor of human nature into a political and social milieu in a very powerful way. And we've basically cut that out of the conservative education. It's almost gone.
Yeah, and it's funny. It is a tragedy. It's also in a sense a source for optimism because it suggests there's actually something we could do. There is a model here for constructing a common virtue that is going to advance the common good, that is decipherable by people, and that, while certainly consistent with a religious morality, doesn't require it necessarily. I I suppose it's to some degree it would be a matter of, well, asking everybody to read Cicero, but we can get into the how do we actually translate that for people today and make it accessible to them and make it a part of education. But from a perspective of substance, I'm curious, what is it in Cicero you would most elevate? I mean, the part that resonates most for me is the way that he frames duties and the idea that morality is built around this set of duties that any person has to those around him, both at the personal level and as a citizen of a nation. I guess you feel free to choose that one as well, or
Yeah.
others that you see as really kind of foundational to that way of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think Cicero was considered, and up until the early 20th century, it was considered vital to have a robust account of a natural law argument of our duties to one another, precisely because we are a natural rights regime, right? That's the Declaration of Independence is concerned with natural rights, the Bill of Rights, right? Most of that is considered to be right enunciated and contextualized natural rights, right, that are put into the Constitution, and many rights retained by the people. So and unexpressed. So when you have that, and that's I actually think that's very wise to have that kind of sort of framework, but it's equally wise to make sure that that framework is accompanied by a robust account of duties, which is famously the Roman contribution in some sense. I would add to that, specifically, I would add to that that how that cashes out it winds up sort of revealing a number of really important details that I think actually makes you a much more shrewd statesman, and a much more sort of thoughtful lawmaker when you understand not only our rights but the sort of origins of our duty in what Cicero calls the complexa caritatis, if you want to get fancy, right? The complex of charity, right? That is to say, all of these crisscrossed loves that come from the recognition of a thousand benevolent sacrifices and gifts of both people around you presently and this train of ancestors and fellow citizens who've gone before you. Everyone from whoever died building the Brooklyn Bridge to the guy who literally keeps the water clean at the water treatment plant up the hill in Northern Virginia, right? Like that, being attentive to all the gifts you have received from others, which winds up being, frankly, the source of, Cicero says, the pursuit of all virtues, right? That if you don't have that gratitude, there's no really reason to get off the couch and do anything for anyone. It's actually the impetus, and so that's one. And then the other one that Cicero does, which I think for a lot of what you're working with Oren, trying to think through, is the number one teaching of the natural law that Cicero brings forward, which everyone knew and was very comfortable with in the previous centuries, previous generations, was the idea that what is morally right, the honorable, right, honestum, is in fact always and also morally useful. So, so the idea of like thinking about a discourse of religion as useful, right, which you engaged in your talk, and you sort of said, forgive me if I'm paraphrasing you poorly, but that a religious person might lean over and go, "I think he doesn't get what religion is." Like, well, okay, maybe, maybe not. Meaning, if you understand the natural law, you have no problem having a utility conversation about higher goods, right? This is very useful for us. So this might be a question of policy. You also have a certain confidence that discussing things as useful is the only way to persuade anyone of anything, right? So the idea like this would be right, right? Well, in fact, no one's ever persuaded by this would be right and high and noble, right? They're actually persuaded by, and doing the right and high and noble thing is so beautiful and so right and so good that it's good for you. So it's good for you, but good for you always. And once you realize that, you actually have a lot more confidence talking in a lower register, knowing that you're not betraying high principles of faith and morality when you make a public policy argument. And so the right, the conservatives, I think, have sort of hamstrung themselves in a kind of pietistic fear of making utility arguments for fear that they're somehow betraying high and noble principles. But they're actually the flip side of the coin. And so you become more adept and confident in discourses of utility, which turn out to be the most persuasive, especially to people who don't share your high and noble priors, right?
That's
So,
yeah, that's fascinating. It resonates remarkably with me because I was just on another podcast from a data science guy, so a very different conversation for the most part. But at the end, he asked for one piece of advice you'd give to young people, and I or, and one thing you think is sort of definitely not true that everyone believes. And I sort of said I think there's at this point it's almost cliche to reject the idea of kind of follow your dreams, but there's also this new cliche on particularly in the tech community, which is this sort of effective altruism idea that whatever makes a lot of money, that must be what I should do. And what I said was you should actually reject both of those things. My advice to you is be useful. That was my two-word piece of advice, and it partly goes to the very sort of common understanding of that being inherently virtuous in a way. But to your point about what conservatives have gotten wrong, it strikes me that it goes right to the heart of some of the more economic critiques we make at American Compass, which is the sort of the worship of the market. I think that we've seen in certain segments of the right has led to this idea that you have no business making a moral judgment about what is or is not useful. It is simply a matter of whatever commands the highest price. And therefore, he who is doing the things that commands the highest price is the most useful. And who are we to question that or analyze it any further? And it's a little different than the point you were making, but that also strikes me as something that enormously has hamstrung our ability to actually engage in these conversations about the common good and thus ultimately to engage in politics.
no, well, I think you're taking the same argument. I'm taking the argument from heads into tails. You're taking the argument from tails into heads, meaning, right? The idea that if you bring up a moral query with regard to the market, that you are threatening the flourishing and utility of the market. I actually think that's exactly wrong, right? Like there are moral considerations which would, in the end, strengthen the abundance, right, that we want to achieve through markets, right? That's the purpose. But if you see no, utility has its own rules, and if you try to bond them to morality, you're screwing up utility. It's like no, they're literally one and the same. They're perspectively different, but they are one act is both going to be moral and useful, right? And if you Cicero goes so far as to call it the most pernicious doctrine, that if you think that something that is useful is immoral, or something that is immoral is useful, he's like, no, you've actually erred. You actually you need to go back and rethink the policy. Like, what are you doing? And I think it's true, and B, it's an astounding truth, and C, it has all kinds of implications for how we think and talk about policy.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I wanted to connect this now to, well, what do we do today with our American nation that does not have, I would say, the contact it needs with these kinds of ideas, and maybe more narrowly a conservative movement that is, I would argue, certainly not as focused on them as it should be. Obviously, we could say everyone could, just needs to go enroll at Hillsdale, but with 60 or 80 slots, it may take a while to solve the problem that way. One thing you'd mentioned previously, and to your point about the literature element of the program offered now, there's this relationship of art to these problems, and the role that art, or maybe media broadly, can or should or historically has played. Is that why it's incorporated in the Hillsdale program, or how do you see that as fitting into a better way?
Yeah, because you don't necessarily have to have all these frameworks shared by everyone to be able to persuade people to certain useful activities, um, right? People can have multiple reasons for joining in an endeavor, right? And they can all cooperate in that endeavor, even though they have different goals in mind, as long as there's a proximate goal like human flourishing, peace, prosperity, things like that that are shared in the short term or in the short horizon. Even if you have the longest horizon of getting to heaven, right, or something, like beyond. Um, yeah. So, and part of the way that works, I think, is what's called rhetorical philosophy, but that also is increased by a study of oratory, which is a required course for us. And frankly, here's one thing I can disagree. You said conservatives haven't done anything in this regard. I was like, they have done one thing, which is launch the classical curriculum movement to
Hmm.
reinvigorate and reincorporate oratorical, rhetorical study, and poetry in this way. And the why it is sort of brought in is one, history is one way of studying human action, right, and the principles thereof, but that requires a lot of detail to pin down a particular thing. And then philosophy, political philosophy, is universal, and but Aristotle says that there's a middle term between them, which is poetry, somewhere between all the details of history and all the universals of political philosophy per se. And that tradition, it's a long one that goes back to people like Cicero and Seneca. Chaucer thought his Canterbury Tales were training for a statesman. More's Utopia was considered the statesman's puzzle. Philip Sidney's uh, um, or excuse me, Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. Hawthorne thought he was doing that kind of work. Melville thought he was doing that kind of work. Longfellow. Um, they were helping to shape political thinkers and shrewd judgment, which is to translate particular principles or ideas into a popular milieu. Put it this way, Aristotle says nobody makes a decision unless they have an image of the beautiful in front of them. Like, this would be beautiful to do. Well, it turns out maybe you need to work on how to beautify your language and make it very persuasive, and what moves the human heart if you actually want to bring people together in common action. And that, to my mind, I joke a lot with people. In the 20th century, everyone talks about the long march of the left through the institutions. Well, we actually have some standing institutions, right? We've got our law schools, theology departments, philosophy departments, law, political philosophy. There's been some survival. There's very little survival in the arts. They've basically been overcome in all but the tiniest few instances, although the embers are starting to sort of recatch fire now. But I think that's, this comes out of Harry Jaffa and John Alvis, who taught Shakespeare as a political thinker. And we do too in our grad school. And I think a lot of people are looking to shape this. In fact, on the pediment of the Capitol, on the House side, there is a little understood picture on the eastern pediment of it's called the Genius of Democracy, and it's this little boy with a light lit staff being protected. Uh, and the word genius is the Latin form of the word wit. And there's a concept in poetry, arts, letters, and political philosophy, right? This rhetorical philosophical tradition of Cicero and Seneca and Shakespeare and others, right? Of Republican wit, that the sort of creative engine, right, of a mobile mind like Odysseus, a man of many turns, that is free but also comes up with the next solution and fixes the next problem because they're not stuck in the mud in one particular tradition or one particular mode. They can move quickly. that's actually the goal of the house, is to protect that genius, right, and to live it. And I think that's part of what this rhetorical philosophy, poetry, oratory sort of contributes, as a kind of sidecar to the main sort of political, philosophical, American history, statecraft studies that we have in our grad school. But I think in general in education, this is something that we have to do in the conservative movement more generally and far more intentionally. We can't just blurt out, uh, man is a political animal. Like that's not enough, right? That's not going to work.
Yeah, the classical school example is such a good one because it sort of combines two challenges we have to overcome. One is just the idea that education should be about teaching anything with respect to values and virtues. And it's interesting. We've done survey work at American Compass asking Americans what they see as the purpose of public education and whether they're focused more or they want to see the focus more on maximizing academic achievement and enrollment in the best college versus developing the skills and values to build a decent life in the community where you live. And that latter one is chosen by 3 or 4 to 1 across classes, across parties, and so forth. I think there's clearly a real hunger for education to play the role, frankly, it always did until the last maybe 30 or 40 years. Maybe the bigger question, though, is if you were to win that argument, what would fill the vessel? Especially today, you could build an entire curriculum of quote classics unquote that are written in the last 50 years and provide an account of values and virtue that are antithetical to everything we're talking about here. My my suspicion is that if, to your point, if conservatives would actually get back to doing this stuff, the more conservative version would actually hold a lot more appeal than what is otherwise so often the default in today's media environment. Is that absurd optimism, or does that seem plausible?
So I'll take myself briefly and then expand out to Hillsdale's activity, but only as if you understand those to be small instances and larger instances, in the case of Hillsdale generally, of a movement that I think is actually happening. And I agree, it needs to happen a lot more. But I mean, I wrote 2 children's books that, one of them was a bestseller, and the other one was launched during COVID and may yet be a bestseller one day. But both of them were basically designed to introduce people to human nature, right? Through Aesop's fables and through fun stories and humorous poems and the tradition and a bunch of beautiful illustrations, right? That kind of what I think as a Christian you should call proto evangelical work, right? Meaning, if you use the scriptures, right, you throw seed out, you cast the seed of the word, and it lands on good soil, and that's when you get great things, right? Well, that begs the question, well, how do you get good soil? I.e., how do you help people build up their human nature, which everybody wants, but so does the Christian, so that there may be a better chance of people being Christian, right? The good soil. So I think that work is, in a certain sense, being done. I'm on the K-12 advisory board for Hillsdale. We've helped a number of states' public education curricula. We've helped many charter schools. Many people have taken our 1776 curriculum. Dr. Spalding and a number of other professors, including myself, all helped DeSantis do a sort of civics ed continuing education for their teachers, where they had to learn the history of the natural law and how it informed the American regime and how it actually sort of plays out in sort of ethics, regardless of whether you believe in God or Vishnu or Allah or Yahweh, whatever. Like, forgive me, Adonai. All of those kinds of arguments, frankly, are being deployed. I think the real risk is how it becomes caricatured as some kind of horrible, evil thing. Um, and as to the idea of like classical texts from the last 50 years, which are not really classical, I do think that one, we have something on our in our arsenal, which is the American people's common sense of like,
Hmm.
yeah, that's not going to work. And in fact, you've already been trying it on my kids for a while, and I got it when I was a kid. It wasn't that great, right? I think that there's a certain kind of hope we have in the like, that's sleight of hand, because everybody kind of knows that's not really the tradition. It's a kind of rebellion from this tradition of coming to understand. I mean, what you might call the Christian humanist tradition. You could drop the Christian side of it and just call it the humanist tradition practiced by Christians, Jews, and others, right? Like, uh, but I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that there is a longer, deeper tradition that's more authentically geared towards human flourishing. And I always tell people, they're like, well, I just want them to do reading, writing, arithmetic. And I'm like, okay, two things. One, you're they're going to have to read, write, and count something. So what's that something going to be, right? It's going to have formational power. So you've got to actually settle that. You can never get away from it. And that's what I think we're realizing with the wokeification of education, that you can't get past that. But two, if you aim high at furnishing their imagination with all of the raw materials to live well and virtuously in accord with nature and human flourishing, you aim at that height, guess what you wind up getting? Rigor, right? You actually get a high tone of ethics and hard work and virtue and seriousness, right? And discipline and sacrifice. And those are the kinds of discourses that get someone to work a little harder to make sure they write a good paper, to actually master their ABCs, to actually go back to the teacher and admit that you cheated and that you actually didn't learn the quadratic, formula, et cetera, right? That kind of aim high, and you might hit reading, writing, arithmetic, is always been the genius of Western education. And we've tried an experiment lately to do without the aiming high, and aiming low at the three R's isn't working.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal point. I'd never thought of it that way. I think one thing that has obviously gone astray in our education system and just in the environment in which we're raising young people is the set of messages we provide them about virtue, about resilience, about how to prepare themselves to be good people and lead successful lives. To your point, that may as well make that the curriculum. As long as they have to be learning something along the way, may as well teach them that. And in that sense, the substance and process almost collapse into the same topic in a way that would be extraordinarily beneficial. And as you mentioned earlier, in a way that I think the classical school movement is blazing a trail for today. We will see, I suppose, how well we can persuade the rest of the nation of its merits. I do think to your point about it sort of being caricatured as evil this or evil that. In my mind, anyway, that sort of connects to where we started with the question of how or whether to draw in the religious connotations of it, because obviously it is entirely consistent with the religious commitments that many leaders of the movement have. And if one is doing a religiously based curriculum, this is what one would put in it. But to the extent that you don't need the religious basis for it to be the right curriculum, I think especially as we sort of try to sell it in the uh, very secular context in which our education and generally political debates play out, being able to sort of speak to it on its own terms, exactly as we've been doing here, I think has a tremendous amount of running room in making it something that could have very broad based appeal and ultimately advance the goals that conservatives have for human flourishing, and the goals that people of faith have for what they want to achieve.
Yeah, no, I agree. It frustrates me to no end that if you recognize that people are afraid of teaching virtue because they think it smells of Christ or Christianity, right? Well, okay, so yeah,
It does, though.
I
I think that
yeah,
that's an accurate description
yeah,
of our culture today.
yeah. So, but if you know that, then it seems to me that if you have any hope of making good soil amongst your neighbors, right, then you should definitely think about the less exalted and humbler work of actually helping them to live according to their nature, so that they may one day be ready to accept what you know is this good seed, but that only grows when it falls on good soil. So it seems to me that the Christian really wants to attend to good natural arguments about what it means to be a human, and what it means to be in community, um, and, uh, uh, and 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 start with their fellow Americans precisely where they're living, and if they're not living in the faith, I think the answer is you kind of want to do both, right? You want to, like, you want to proselytize, but you also want to just build them up. But if you can't distinguish between the two, you're going to be a lot less successful at both. And I think that's something to think about and sort of bear in mind as you move forward.
I think that is a perfect note to end on. Dr. Matt Mehan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I know the American Compass audience will enjoy it, but more importantly, learn a tremendous amount from you on the topic.
It's a pleasure, Art.
This has been the American Compass podcast. I suppose I should have mentioned a couple of episodes ago we had the full lecture that we've been discussing here, so you can go back and listen to that as well. And we will be back again soon with another episode on any topic from Cicero to the CHIPS Act to something in between.